Good morning. This is Dr. David A. Padgett. This is the World Regional Geography 1010, Section 98A course. Today is March 24th, and it's the spring 2021 semester. So today we will start off with the usual housekeeping, and then we will move on to the subject matter focusing upon Unit C, which is Geography of Latin America and the Caribbean. And specifically, we are looking at the population geography of the region. So I'll get to this reading assignment in just a moment. Again, this week you are working on your second research quiz 2. Student view here. So here's research quiz 2. It's due on March 26th, Monday. And so again, research quiz 2 has basically the same format as research quiz 1. I have been over numerous times what I expect to see in terms of your answers and your answered justifications or explanations and your reference sources. Again, if you have questions, let me know. This quiz is due on Friday at 11 o'clock in the morning. And of course, there is a 6-hour grace period. And then you start losing points, 3 points every 6 hours after the grace period. So there's only 10 questions. You should be able to answer them. Don't see why you shouldn't be able to answer the questions. But if you have questions about the exam, please let me know. Housekeeping. Issue number 2 is that you do have an article review due on Monday. Quiz due Friday, article review due Monday. And we will be working through the population geography of Latin America, which I will get to right now. So picking it up where we left off last time, we were looking at the urban geography of Latin America. That's our focus, that's our emphasis today. And so we started there last time, and we'll pick it up. So just as a review, once this PowerPoint opens up, just as a review, brief review, we started with a discussion of how cities in the entire world are growing. And so we made the point that in recent years, within the last 10 years or so, the world's human population has become predominantly urban. And so that is a new phenomenon. Prior to, or for most of human history, most people lived in rural areas. Now we have these large growing cities, many of which are in Latin America: Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Buenos Aires. Millions of people in these cities are living without housing, living without access to clean water, living without access to sanitation. And I Explained last time that those of you who are living on campus, or when you were living on campus in Nashville, even if you didn't drink the water out of the tap, you showered in it, you bathed in it, you prepared food with it. And that water, of course, came from the Cumberland River. That's our drinking water source. And then when we flush in Nashville, that human waste winds up in the Cumberland River. So our drinking water source and our wastewater destination is the same body of water. And that's usually the case in most cities, whether you're from Chicago or Detroit or wherever. And so that might be cause for alarm, but we are fortunate enough in this country to have infrastructure to protect us from the unclean elements of water that we draw out of the Cumberland River. And we also have infrastructure that purifies water before we put it back into the Cumberland River after we flush or wash it down the drain. Other parts of the world don't have that infrastructure. Other parts of the world, millions of people live in cities where their drinking water source is the same as their human waste destination. And we can easily see how that would result in diseases and pestilences and problems and death. And so you see here, millions of people die each year. A lot of them are children, die each year because of lack of clean water and sanitation. We talked about how this is happening, rural to urban migration, pull and push factors that are pulling and pushing people towards urban areas globally. Over urbanization is when cities infrastructure cannot support human population. Too many people, not enough water. Too many people, not enough sanitation. Too many people, not enough housing. Too many people, not enough electricity. Too many people, not enough food. Hospitals. All of these amenities are what we expect to find in cities. And we took a look at a favela. A favela is, I guess, a word for a slum in Latin America. And we talked about that infrastructure. We looked at, and then we got to this slide. So remember, Mexico City is one of the largest cities in the world. And you can see from this graphic, it says, after waiting for more than 5 hours at a water distribution center to get delivery of her weekly ration of water. Just think about that. If you want to get water in this country, you can just go get up, turn the tap. Or if you get pressed, you can go to the grocery store and get some bottled water. Not for free, but it's not expensive. You can get, 24 pints of bottled water for $3 and something at most grocery stores here. Not very expensive at all. But in other parts of the world, this is what people have to do. They have to wait in line for 5 hours to get a weekly ration of clean water. This is what people have to do to get water in other parts of the world. And this is in the city. And this is in Mexico City. So Mexico is not one of the poorest countries in the world. Mexico, if we were to divide the world up into quintiles, the top 20% of wealthy countries in the world, then you have that next tier. Mexico would be in that second tier. They're like upper middle class on the world stage. The United States, Japan, most of Europe is in that first tier, right? Wealthiest countries in the world. Mexico is in the second tier. So there are three more tiers below where Mexico is. And this is what's happening in Mexico. So you can only imagine what's happening in places like Afghanistan or most of the countries in Africa when it comes to urban areas and infrastructure and health. We are very sheltered and very fortunate in this country. And when some of you start traveling overseas, you'll see it firsthand. You will see situations like this firsthand. The caption goes on. It says, Raquel Villanueva, 31, prepares to wash her dishes at her home in Mexico City. Many of the city's 20 million people get by on as little as 1 hour of running water per week. So that's urban life in other parts of the world, uh, and including Latin America. So in the first, or in the last unit, Unit B, we briefly discussed urban structure, and we talked about these various zones in the concentric ring model that is common to cities in the United States. And we talked about that in the last unit, Unit B. And we mentioned that the reason that we have this spread across urban regions is due to the automobile and due to the fact that we have um, the infrastructure that supports automobile transportation. We have highways, we have streets, built roads. When people come to the United States from other parts of the world, one of the things that they're amazed with is that we can drive everywhere in this country. Right? We can drive to just about any place in this country. That's not true everywhere. Not every country, first of all, not all countries have roads like we do, paved roads. And in this country, there are more cars in the United States than there are licensed drivers. We have more cars than there are licensed drivers in this country. But if you go to other parts of the world, there might be 100 cars for every 1,000 people. Even in countries like Brazil that are relatively advanced, Argentina, only 1 in 10 people might have an automobile. People just don't have own cars in other parts of the world like they do here. So as a result, the urban infrastructure does not develop such that people can drive everywhere. And so as you can see, what happens is in Latin America, the sector model is dominant. And so let me just go to the next slide. So here's a generalized model of a Latin American city. And so notice that in the Latin American city, we do have the central business district. And then notice there's this spine. So in many Latin American cities, there's a grand boulevard, like this grand street that has upscale shops and restaurants and businesses and commercial development and all of that, right? And then off of the spine, notice this green area, this is called the elite residential sector. So the wealthy people live in very close proximity to the central business district. That's the opposite, for the most part, historically, of what has happened in our country. In our country, traditionally, wealthy people live farther out in the suburbs. Now, we know that gentrification is happening. And for a variety of reasons that I explained in the last unit, wealthy people are moving closer into the city. But by and large, most wealthy people still live in the suburbs and in those outer rings in the United States. But in Latin America, because the automobile transportation infrastructure is not present, even wealthy people don't have cars for the most part. And so they live right here in close proximity to where they might own businesses or do businesses or like to shop and engage in those kinds of activities. Notice there's this area on the outskirts called the zone of peripheral squatter settlements. This is where we find the favelas. This is where we find people living in slums and unplanned settlements on the outskirts of town. So it's almost the complete opposite of what we have. And then these people live up in the hills on the outskirts of town. And you may be wondering at this point, well, what are the percentages? What are the percentages of people who are living in unplanned settlements versus, say, middle class or middle income housing. Um, let me just take a trip back. If we were to go back a few slides and I was to ask you, are there people in Nashville living like this? Most of you would probably say, oh, no, Dr. Padgett, there's no people living in shacks and living outside of Nashville. Of course there are. For a few years, I used to work, not just me, myself, and students in my urban geography class. I'll be teaching urban geography during Maymester. It will be virtual. But when the class wasn't virtual, we used to work with the Homelessness Commission. We used to actually volunteer in the homeless count. So cities engage in counting homeless people so that we or a city can approach the federal government for funding based upon how many homeless people are in the city. So the homeless people have to be counted. For years, the city would count homeless people in Nashville. Most of the homeless people in Nashville were downtown. Okay. And as Nashville's downtown started to gentrify, the homeless people started to get pushed farther and farther away from downtown, because the way that Nashville still, to some degree, handles the homelessness situation is by arresting homeless people for being homeless, right? And so because of that fear, the homeless people got pushed farther out. However, the homeless shelter is downtown for men, the women's shelter is downtown, the homeless clinic is downtown. Most of the homeless services are downtown, but homeless people started getting pushed away from downtown. So my class, the urban geography class, we use GPS receivers, global positioning systems receivers, and volunteer with the homeless count to not only count the homeless people, but determine their location. When we did that, of course, we found that there were homeless people outside of downtown, and forced the city to provide services to people who were not downtown, right? When we were doing that homeless count, yes, we found people who were living exactly like this, living outside in tents. There was even a place in Nashville called Tent City that was a big city downtown with nothing but homeless people living in shacks and tents, living exactly like this. Now, when we did the homeless count in Nashville, in this country, we found maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people who were what we call unhoused, right? They're not living in a hotel, they're not living in a car, they're just out there like this. Now, if 3,000 people in Nashville are unhoused, that's maybe around maybe 1% of Nashville's population. Now, in Latin America and the Caribbean, people living in favelas can be as high as 25 to 33% of the population living like this. No drinking water, no sanitation, very little housing. So if we think about it, if a city like Mexico City has 20 million people, and let's take the low end estimate of that. Let's say that 25% of the people in Mexico City with 20 million people are in unplanned settlements or favelas or slums. That's 5 million people. 5 million people living under those conditions. So you can only imagine. Look, there are about 5 million people in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Imagine if everybody in Atlanta was homeless. Tyler Perry, all the Atlanta Hawks basketball players, Usher, all the Atlanta housewives, everybody's homeless in Atlanta. Imagine that, 5 million people, everybody in Atlanta is homeless. That's how many people are homeless in some of these large cities, or essentially living under homeless conditions in some of these cities in Latin America. And so you can see the magnitude of the problem. And they are primarily on the outskirts of the city. Now there is, you might ask, well, you got all these, and the wealthy portion of the population is very small in these Latin American countries. Maybe 1%, 2% of the population is in this wealthy sector, which to some degree, if you remember from last unit, does mirror what's happening in our country. We have about 1% of the population that has over 70% of the wealth in this country, right? But the level of disparity is not the same. At least in our country, even the poorest of the poor, even if people living in public housing, they still have running water most of the time, air conditioning sometimes, heat. People aren't just outside living in the streets, okay? But that's what's happening to millions of people in these cities in Latin America and the Caribbean and all over the world. Now, there is a middle class, but the middle class, again, is very small. And middle class in Latin America is not middle class here. Middle class in Latin America might be um, a, a, a man working for the government, and he has, with his wife, 9 children, and they live in a 600 square foot house. Now, think about 600 square feet. If you're living in an apartment, look up the square footage of your apartment. If you're living in an apartment right now, you probably, if you're in a 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom apartment, that's probably at least 800 square feet. And that's just you and maybe your roommate. Think about having 11 people in 600 square feet. But that's middle class. If you were in your apartment complex and you looked around and there was a family living next door to you in a 2 bedroom apartment and there were 11 of them in there, you might call Channel 5. You might call Child Protective Services. If there were a man and a woman in one room and there are 9 children in the other room, you might call Child Protective Services, or somebody might, maybe not you. But that's very abnormal for us, But in other parts of the world, that's very common. You might have parents, grandparents, everybody living in 600 square feet, 3 generations in a 600 square foot house, and they're just fine. We're the ones here in this country that have to have a 2,500 square foot house, 3,000 square foot house, 3-car garage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? That's us. Other parts of the world are not like that. So we are in a very unique situation in terms of our urban infrastructure. Other parts of the world are not. So you can kind of see um, the differences in urban uh, development in our country versus others. And so I will again move to some other portions of the lecture here. So I just wanted to focus upon urban development. Here's another cartogram. So remember, a cartogram, instead of using primarily colors, uses shapes to convey a message to the map reader. So a cartogram uses shapes to convey a message to the map reader. And so with this cartogram, notice we have urban population represented as circles, and the size of the circle, it represents a certain number of people in a city. And so here we have this 23 million person circle. So if you compare that to Sao Paulo, so Sao Paulo has clearly more than 20 million people, and you can see the size of some of these cities in South America extending over well over 10 million people, approaching 20 million people in Rio, Buenos Aires, and so on and so forth. This is somewhat of a combined choropleth map and cartogram, as you can see. And so We have colors and shapes combined to represent certain uh, magnitudes of population in each city. And so you can see here another article where we discuss things such as deforestation and water crises. Many of you are probably familiar with the situation in Flint, Michigan. And so Flint, Michigan water crisis was very extreme for this country, very unusual for this country. But in other parts of the world, unfortunately, the situation in Flint, Michigan, where people don't have access to clean water is common. Here it was national news for years. And I don't think people in Flint have clean water to this day. And so that was seen as a crisis. It was seen as a very bad situation. And of course, it was a bad situation, or is a bad situation. It seems to be continuing. But that's fairly normal in other parts of the world. People not having access to drinking water. And as climate change occurs, and as we continue to see urban growth uh, becoming more of a trend, we will unfortunately see this crisis going further. Um, some of you might have heard of an artist named Michael Jackson. He was a very famous singer. And in 1996, he recorded a video in the favelas, one of the favelas in Rio de Janeiro. And so, why did Michael Jackson do this? Well, he was trying to call attention to what was happening in the favelas, in the slums in Latin America. It was a story that was really not popular, so to speak. And so, a lot of people criticized Michael Jackson, said he was weird. He died, unfortunately, at a relatively young age under very bizarre circumstances. But Michael Jackson, in spite of what anybody wants to say, was one of the greatest humanitarian artists we've ever seen. He more than gave back, right? In spite of all of his quirkiness and eccentricity. And so this was one of the cases. I'm going to play this video. Yeah, so excellent video. And so you can read about the story behind the video. Of course, the video was directed by another, I guess they call themselves artivists. That's being an activist and an artist at the same time. Spike Lee directed it. And so, yeah, you can see that Michael Jackson brought attention to this issue of urban poverty, extreme urban poverty in the favelas of Latin America, long before it became recognized. I mean, he was very much ahead of his time, and so you can get a pretty good idea of what's happening in some of these areas, even to this day. And of course, you can easily see how the issues might be exacerbated with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, if we look up Brazil and COVID-19, in fact, now Brazil is just really leading the world. And it's just an absolute crisis in Brazil with COVID-19. specifically, and this is as of today. Um, and so we can only imagine that in places where you have um, high numbers of individuals living in each household, multi generations of individuals living in households, perhaps substandard housing, that many people would transmit the virus very easily. And so it's a pretty bleak numbers. It says here that Brazil might exceed 300,000 deaths. And so if we go back to the Population Reference Bureau data sheet, remember, United States has, we have over 330 million people in this country and about 500,000 deaths. So considering that 500,000, that's perhaps 1/3 of 1% of our population. But if we look at, in Latin America at Brazil, and so probably have to, so Brazil has about 211 million people. And so 300,000 is going to be a higher proportion of their population than what we're seeing here, obviously. So that pretty much covers the Latin American population geography. So your, again, emphasis should be upon interpreting interpreting age sex diagrams. And so I meant to fix that link last time. So CIA World Fact Book. Probably need to fix that link, but it's pretty simple to do a search here. And if we go to B, say Brazil, for example, and we go to people in society, and then under each country, we can find the population pyramid. And so you are examining a population pyramid now for this week's quiz. And again, if we look at Brazil compared to United States population pyramid, we do see some significant differences. Let's see if I can do a cross comparison here. Okay, so there's United States population pyramid, Brazilian population pyramid. So you can see the differences. United States, people living into the older age groups. And so in Brazil, not so much. Which brings me to a point that I didn't really emphasize, which was life expectancy as another variable that we look at in terms of measuring or examining population. And so life expectancy can be really interesting. So here's a life expectancy for the United States of America. I mentioned this before. Average 79 years of age, life expectancy, and we have 76 years of age for men, 81 years of age for women, and that's the United States life expectancy. Um, Notice that it's higher in Canada. Interesting, even though the United States has a higher is a wealthier country than Canada, but yet people in Canada live longer. But let's look at the United States compared to countries in Latin America. Um, Here's Costa Rica. Costa Rica's life expectancy is slightly higher than that of the United States, higher for both women and men, and yet their gross national income per capita is only $18,670 per person per year. Let's look at Cuba. Cuba has the same life expectancy as the United States, 79 years of age for both genders. And so Cuba, as you can see, if we go back to the CIA World Factbook, and if there's data missing from that spreadsheet, we can easily go to the CIA World Factbook and get missing data. So if we go to Cuba and look up Cuba's economy, their GDP per capita is only about $12,000 per person, compared to $60,000 per person from the United States. So Cuba has about a fifth of our wealth, and yet the equivalent life expectancy. So, we have to ask questions in terms of, okay, even though we have more wealth here, does that translate into longer life? Does that translate into higher quality of life? And so if you compare the United States to Costa Rica and Cuba, that answer might be, well, not really. And it raises a lot of questions. It raises a lot of questions. I mean, shouldn't we have much longer life expectancy? Shouldn't we, with all of our money and wealth and technology, shouldn't we have longer life expectancy than some of these countries that are very poor, don't have nearly the medical infrastructure that we have, don't have nearly the access to hospitals and health centers that we have, not even close, but yet people live longer there. It's an interesting question that will take further exploration, and we'll probably explore those questions further next week. When we continue our conversation, we start to talk about the economic geography of Latin America. When we segue there and start to look at issues related to quality of life that maybe extend beyond wealth. So I'm going to end things. I think we've pretty much covered everything that we need to cover here. Again, you should reflect upon chapters 287 to 296 in chapter 11, and in your reading, make reference to some of the vocabulary words that have been brought forth during this lecture, so that you'll be prepared for whatever happens next week and the following week. Does anyone have any questions about anything at this time before I sign off? Everybody understands midterm grades. Everybody's Okie dokie. If you have, I'm going to stop recording right now. Have a nice day.